McClaren with the Leadership Loading Podcast. Today we're talking about writing your Biopedia with Dr. Scott. Let's go.
Hi, I'm Dr. Latayne C. Scott.
So let's start off with tell me about your background and how you help veterans go forward from there, and then we'll talk a little bit more.
Well, I've actually been writing for Military Officer magazine for about almost 25 years. And one of the reasons they come to me to write articles is not because I have a military background, which I don't. My dad was a Marine. My brother was in the service. My nephew served in Afghanistan, but I actually have no personal experience with the military. But in a magazine like Military Officer that's read by families as well as the officers themselves, they like it because I can go to a military officer and make them translate militaries to English so people can understand it that aren't military. Of course, there are always acronyms and things like that, but it's been my pleasure to help veterans, especially in any way that I can through the only skill that I have, which is writing and speaking. And so in the process, I've got to interview some really cool people like Gary Sinise from Wounded Warriors, many famous people, Charlie Daniels, all these people that really they also use their talents to help people in the military. And one of my trainings is to be able to teach people how to write about their own experiences that aren't writers, that didn't start out to be writers.
Great. And you usually work on like biopedias. What is a biopedia as compared to something else?
Well, people talk about writing their memoir or writing their autobiography. These are the stories of their own lives. And even though I'm a professional writer, I have 31 books in print. When I sat down to write my own story at the request of my daughter, because I've had a very interesting life, even though I'm a professional writer, even though I train writers, I didn't know how to start. I mean, where do you start in writing your own story? Do you start with your birth? Do you start with your parents' story? Do you start with your grandparents' story? If you're only going to tell part of your life, how do you put it together in such a way that people understand the sequence, if there's a sequence there, or just get the point if you're trying to get the point across. And so I struggled with this myself. And so I read a book by a woman who is actually a children's book author, and her name was Amy Krauss Rosenthal. And she wrote something called Encyclopedia of an Ordinary Life. And she said nothing interesting had ever happened to her, but she did, or she wasn't responsible, I guess, for things that she thought was interesting. But she had a lot of cool stories about her life. So she took these stories and with various different methods that I'll describe to you a little bit later as we get into it, she just took the good stuff, the best bits of her life, and wrote them like they were just a little article, and then arrange them alphabetically like you would read in an encyclopedia. And I thought, what a genius idea, because I don't have to worry about where to start it. And also, for those of us who are near the end of our lives in the beginning, we don't have to necessarily end it, which we can't do, of course, being dead. But what people really want to know, especially our families, is they want to know the really cool stories that happen to us. And I found something very interesting. I had a friend, or still have a friend, named Nick Lehman. Nick Lehman was a reporter for the Albuquerque Journal. And of course, I'm wearing my Indian jewelry today to show you that I'm a native New Mexican. And he quit his job and started focusing on his talents as a photographer. And what he did was he went especially to a lot of the code talkers and Native Americans and other elderly veterans in our state, and told them, I will make a free studio setting for you and a portrait for your family of you in your military, whatever you choose to be, however you choose to be remembered. And he found out something very interesting is these guys told him stories they'd never told their families, never told anybody. And those stories became as precious to the family as the portraits did, because a portrait can tell you so much, but the stories. And I saw the same thing with my friend Paul Beatty. Paul Beatty was a man that was very dear to me. He passed away about 5 years ago. Paul Beatty was actually on the beach at Pearl Harbor. And I say he was on the beach because he and his buddy had taken what they call, I think they called it shore leave. I'm not sure exactly what his terminology would have been. They pitched a putt tent on the beach, and they get up on that Sunday morning and they see all these planes coming over. And he was actually listed as AWOL for several days because he wasn't on a ship, of course, when they took, but he went and helped serve food to in a chow line to the workers who were rescuing people. But he never told much of that story to his own family, and it was only toward the very end of his life. I mean, he had his medals. They put his medals and his other awards, in a frame with this picture of him when he was a private, but he wouldn't tell his family until the very end. And what a tragedy. And you know this, Jason, what a tragedy it would have been not to have that story if that had died with him, because that is a really cool story that his family wanted to know, but he just didn't feel like he knew how to tell it. And so one of the purposes that I have is to give non-writer veterans a way to write their stories, the good stuff, what your family wants to know, what you really want remembered, in a way that doesn't, bust your brain and take too much technological knowledge or anything else.
I like how you mentioned the bringing stories to life, basically, and things that people may have forgot or even suppressed. And we'll talk about trauma here in a little bit. I know myself, as I outline things or start working on projects, and once you start writing things down, or even if you're typing them, you start remembering things that, I didn't, I kind of compartmentalize that or forgot it. So you kind of talked about memories. How do you unlock wisdom when you're writing your
The Biopedia.
Biopedia? Sorry.
That's okay. I just think biography,
I keep
encyclopedia.
wanting to say biopic.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
a film version.
exactly. Well, I teach a technique, and I'll share it with your listeners and with you. And that is, when you get one of those memories or those ideas, it's often physically impossible because you're doing something else to write that all up. So I train people to keep with them either, of course, everybody has a phone with the notes section on there, but to keep with you, if at all possible, something to write on, and to write three things: the what we call the SSS, the single SST, the single stabbing truth. What was the point of this incident that you want to remember? And then write just a few lines, just a few, maybe even just 5 or 6 lines. Need to remember this happened in basic training and with the sergeant, and that will help you remember. It's not the whole story, but you can take that, which we call our KTSs, keyword, title, and single stabbing point. You can take that and put it away until later, and you haven't forgotten the story because you've got the prompt, to yourself, but you don't have to worry about working it into what you're doing right now. And when I tell this to people, they go, of course, that's a great idea, because even I, as a professional writer, I may be writing 8 hours a day, but I cannot include everything that pops in my head about Project A when I'm working on Project B. And so let me show you. I'm not just kidding. See all these little pieces of paper? They're all part of a book. And some of them are little tiny. They should be bigger pieces of paper, but they're not. Here's more. All of these things that help me remember that, so I don't forget them and I can come back to them. And I've included enough information in that tiny little note to myself that I can write it up later without forgetting it. And what you said about memories coming to the surface, here's the thing about writing your experiences. One memory provokes another. And the analogy that I get for that is, I don't know what your family dynamics are, and every family dynamic is different. But when you get a bunch of the old timers in the family together, maybe at Thanksgiving dinner or something, and one person tells a story about Uncle Joe, and then somebody else says, yeah, I remember the time that he did such and such. And somebody else will say, well, that's kind of like the time Susie did this, Stories engender stories. And so you don't ever have to wonder what to write about, because as you start into this process, I found this without fail with everybody I've trained. And I'd love to tell you about how I've trained specifically a group of 35 veterans here in New Mexico, how I did that. But I've found with every one of those that one story leads to another story, and you're never at a loss of what to tell. And you never have to worry about where it fits in a timeline, which I'll talk about in a minute, because the stories are the best bits. You can find them, they're alphabetically arranged, and you've got the very best things that you want to remember already written down. And I also call this the 10-minute memoir, because you can take that card and you can write up that story in 10 minutes or so enough to satisfy yourself and go back and tweak it later.
Definitely. And yeah, we'll get into the, how you teach people to write things.
Hmm.
So for veterans, first responders, anyone listening to this,
Hmm.
why do people want to hear our story? Why do we need to take the time to go ahead and do this?
I found out something very interesting, Jason, recently. I asked the question on my Facebook pages. I have several Facebook pages. My kind of personal page, Latayne, and then I have author Latayne C. Scott, and then I have some other writing related things. And I asked the question, what is your number one reason for not completing a memoir or an autobiography of your own? And people came forward with lots of reasons: time, don't know where to start, the kinds of things that I address in my training. But I was gobsmacked with a couple of the comments when people said, well, more than a couple, I'd say the largest single group of comments said, nothing interesting has ever happened to me. And then there was another group of people that said, that's narcissistic. That's self-focused. Who am I that I think I should write anything that it should be interesting? And who'd want to read it? And of course, I believe people that answer like that about that it's narcissistic or whatever are writing for the wrong audience. They're thinking that they're going to write this for general publication. And it's true, strangers may not be interested in your stories, but your family probably is very interested. And these are things that your grandkids want to know. And this has been so important in my life, Jason, that when my kids were little, I told them people are going to tell you lies about the Holocaust and about what happened in Germany. And we had an elderly man in our congregation that had been shot down over, I think it was occupied Poland, but I'm not sure. Anyway, he was shot down and he survived by living 3 days in a pile of chicken manure in the winter. And of course, the manure kept him warm, right? And he actually, in his military service, saw some of these death camps. And I took my kids, little as they were, and this was the man from our church. I said, Mr. Roy, you know he's a trustworthy person. He's going to tell you something. I don't want you ever to forget this. And of course, if I had had a brain in my head at the time, I would have written this all down to remember more than the chicken manure story, and exactly where it happened and what year it happened and all that. But I didn't. I just wanted my kids to come away with that impression. And you guys that put your life on the line, either as first responders, veterans, anybody that's on the front line to protect me and my family, I owe you this to teach you how to be able to preserve these for your family, if for no one else. But even better, write it for yourself. That's what I found out teaching these veterans, these 35 veterans. Sometimes you just need to kind of sort things out, and you can sort them out if you can tell one story at a time. You don't have to tell the whole story. If you can just try to figure out what happened on that hill, if you can just try to figure out what happened as you try to process what happened to you, like my nephew. I mean, he's walking along. He's an IED expert, and he's got his buddy beside him. And 1 minute his buddy is there, and the next minute his buddy is gone. How do you process that one moment in time? Well, sometimes the only way you can process it is writing it, not for publication, not for your family. You may not want them to know that. Write it for yourself so you can figure it out.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to my next question on how can this help with trauma and moving past trauma if we're writing it all down.
Well, I have to brag on the man, Commander Jim Tritton, U.S. Navy retired, who was a winner of the Military Writers Society of America Writer of the Year a couple of years ago. And this man kind of has become one of my heroes. He goes out to the VA hospital and he sits with a group of vets and helps them in processing information by writing it down. He very sacrificially does that. And he's the one that saw my article in Military Officer magazine about writing a Biopedia. That was about a year ago. If any of your listeners are officers, they can look back. I think it was about maybe a little over a year ago that was in there. And he says, I read that article, and he said, these guys don't have the money to pay for a writing course. And many vets absolutely. I mean, they're keeping body and soul together, just with what they have and what few benefits, and I say this sincerely, few benefits they get. He said, I'm a member of a local writers group, which is Southwest Writers. It's the biggest writers group in the Southwest. He said, through Southwest Writers, we get grants to do things to help the military and help people to write. And so 2 years ago, he and his buddies took some of these stories from some of these veterans and published them in an anthology called Holes in Our Heart. And these are written by not only by the veterans, but by their family members as well. Really impressive book. You should check it out. Holes in Our Hearts. And he came to me and he said, I think I can get a grant through the New Mexico State Arts Council to pay you to teach these people. You get paid for doing it, because it was an intensive 4 weeks. I mean, if you can imagine, with 35 veterans, we're talking about an intensive 4 weeks of recorded trainings and other things. But he said, we can get it paid for and it won't cost them a penny. And so that's how I was able to do that. And I don't know if there are other programs available to other people in other states to do that. I mean, I'm certainly not trying to discourage anybody from taking my full course, but I'm not here to sell the course. I'm here to tell you the few things that you can do to get started in this, which is exactly what I did when I started writing my own Biopedia. First of all, is keep some notes. And the second thing, can I go on to the second thing, or do you have another follow-up question there? Well, it will occur to somebody that you've got all these stories. And how do you know how will somebody who doesn't know your history know when these things happened and where they happened? And so I teach people how to make a timeline. And you can make a timeline. It's very easy with military service, where you served, all your deployments, all your, and then when you tell a story, you can say, when I was in Hawaii, this happened. When I was in Afghanistan, this happened. When I was in Vietnam, my first tour, this happened. And you say that in the story, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel for the timeline, because you got a timeline there. Isn't that genius? I wish I'd thought of it. Amy Krauss Rosenthal did that in her book. She showed that she made a timeline of different themes in her life. She didn't do her whole life. But if we're writing a life story, that's a really simple way not to have to give all the background detail for every story that you tell.
Yeah, I use music and movies as my timelines. Like I know I was deployed on when this movie came out, or when this song came out, and so I have to go and Google a lot of times when the movie came out so I can remember where I was.
Yeah, that's a genius way to do a timeline. I would love to see that if you ever want to share it.
Yeah, definitely. And I know my second deployment was the day Katrina hit New Orleans. So I know that was when I deployed there. So yeah, I use those as my mark.
My son was there when that hit.
In New Orleans?
He was actually in Houston.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so he ended up taking in, literally, a family was sitting on the street. He saw a woman, and I think she had 3 or 4 children. And she was literally sitting on a corner, and she had made her way to Houston, but she had nothing. And so he and his wife took, and this was another race, not even our race, our culture, took him in and said, we'll help you out, because, can your heart not break when you see somebody sitting on a corner with nothing, But yes, I understand how movies and music would have helped trigger some things for you with that.
Dr. Scott, can you give us one leadership tip? If you had 1 minute to tell somebody something to move on their way, what would you give them? What advice?
Yeah, I have a free resource that anybody can have, and Jason will provide it for you. And it gives some of these details, but it's in a handout that tells you how to help a senior write a biopedia. Because if you don't want to tackle your own life story right now, I know you, like I, have elderly family members that you want to get their stories down. How do you do that if they're not computer savvy? How do you do that? How do you get these stories down and preserve them for posterity? So with my compliments, that's how to help a senior write a biopedia. We'll get you started, and that's my tip.
Great. We'll put that in the show notes below. And then if anyone wanted to reach out to you directly, how could they?
They can write me at Latayne, Latayne, at Latayne.com. That's my email.
We'll clean all that up, and then we'll get it posted. It should go live Friday.
Great. Would you send me a link to it, and I'll help you publicize it too?
Hey, Dr. Scott, thank you for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. Right. Okay.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.
There are thousands of leadership and management podcasts to choose from. We're glad you chose the Leadership Loading podcast, a Go Heroes production. If you'd like to support Go Heroes Inc., visit www.goheroes.org. And with that, it's time to wrap up today's show. Thank you so much for listening. We sincerely hope you liked it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with your family and friends. Let's all grow together. Thanks for listening to the Leadership Loading Podcast. Leadership inspired.